Welcome, folks, to the 10th of April, 2024 Aries Working Group call. Hope you all had a eventful eclipse watching experience if you were in such a position for this particular eclipse. There's one in Australia in a couple of years if you didn't make this one. So um, glad you're all here. Is there any you're welcome to add yourself to the attendees list or any other adjustments to the wiki. Even though it won't show up on my screen live, it will get merged in for anyone else seeing this later. Anyone new that would like to introduce themselves? All right, and announcements. Oh, Steven?
Yeah, who's that James Ebert guy?
He introduced himself last week.
Oh, he did.
Oh,
That's
hello,
right.
hello.
I mean, I
I
don't want
am,
to. I don't want to stop on your reintroduction, James. Please go ahead.
I couldn't remember which meeting he reintroduced himself. And I figured out where
yes.
Port Townsend was. I
Ah,
was
nice.
I was thinking it was further west on the peninsula, but now I get it.
Yeah,
Anyway, welcome
yeah.
back.
Also,
Thank you.
the vampire town is called Forks out of the
It is
Twilight
Forks.
series. I did listen to the
Exactly.
Ah,
call. Stephen led the meeting, and I listened to the call, and I couldn't offer the answer because it was, of course, recorded.
Don't you hate listening to recordings when you want to jump right in and
Yes. Anyway, James, I don't know if you're going to say anything else. Sorry, we kind of like
no.
bantered all
Happy to
over the
be
top of
here.
it.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. So I hadn't listened to the call before the Monday's did come user group, and James showed up, and I'm like, what? And I mentioned someone, they're like, oh yeah, he was on the Aries call. And I was like, wait a minute, I totally missed the moments of reentrance. Anyway, happy to have you back. Um, IW is next week, um, and of course, this call being on a Wednesday is squarely in the middle of it. Um, I will be there and not easily able to host or run the call. Does anyone want this call to be run next week bad enough to run it? That's the real question. Anyone is welcome to volunteer if they'd like. Otherwise, we'll cancel this call next week.
I'm not sure there'll be enough people here to have a meaningful discussion.
That's definitely a possibility. Okay, we will call this canceled then. Um, any other announcements we should have, but don't. All right, Stephen, also thank you for several things. One is running last week. Um, Also, the cleanup of the release status and work update section of the doc. I appreciate that. This is my secret reason why I periodically ask Stephen to run the meeting is that he cleans everything up in the process. So now you really know why. But no, I'm super grateful. Any updates that folks want to share from projects?
Akapai release 012 RC3, which we expect to be the last RC before the 012 release, is out in the world, and we're definitely looking for feedback on it if people could take a look. Everything you need should be out in all the normal places. Documentation's been updated and published. So yeah, if you see things that need to be updated, let us know.
Very cool. Other updates to share? All right. On the agenda today, there's a few topics we didn't get to last week with enough time, and so they are higher on the agenda today. So we have the DIDCOM message service endpoint issue that it has useful links here, and then also the mediation issue as well. And I forgot to warn Daniel we were talking about this. Colton, will you ping Daniel and mention? Oh, you know what? He's going to be late because he's got a conflict at the early part of this. But anyway, if you Colton, if you wouldn't mind dropping him a note that says when he's ready, and we can talk about that. There's a quick note about message pickup delivery during live mode for mediators using that protocol. And then we have the quick follow-up discussion that only got very lightly touched on at the end of last week's call about removing NDSDK from ACOPI and the unqualified did update, which is good status, but I'm curious if we can actually set a goal date, if we're close enough that we can actually put a pin in that. To target as a community. Any changes that we want to make to the agenda before we get going today?
Sam, not change, but if it's possible, I raised a question in the ACAPI about scalability information. If I can just raise that here and see if anybody has anything.
Yeah, let me stick it right here, and then we'll get to it before the end if we.
Thanks.
Here we go. All right. Stephen, did you want to lead this particular discussion, or shall I attempt with corrections?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So the
'Cause I
question
don't
is, yeah. I think I have some context, and I added some links here that's relevant. Here are a variety of issues. Here's one Credo and ACOPI. Here's also a did peer method one that talk about the different name of the service endpoint for DIDCOM. Oh, Colton's even here, and he opened the issue, so that's fun. So here's so we have DID communication and DIDCOM messaging as two of the types of service endpoints that actually kind of exist. And so there's a little bit of discussion around that. And then a longer discussion here. I will not attempt to fully summarize all of this, but anyone who has a particularly important piece of this that would be relevant, that would be super welcome. We also have the issue in ACOPI with a link over there, and discussions about kind of how to make this happen. There's also, of course, the spec changes listed here, and a handful of issues that also relate to this. And the big issue is, what do we actually list as the type of the service endpoint within a DID document? This is painful when there's different implementations that do different things. And so that's where all they are. Any other initial color that anyone wishes to add before I go on a little bit?
Just that I think some of the initial confusion with DIDCOM messaging is the fact that the DID communication used a different format, and I don't think people were expecting the format to change between the two.
I think that's probably relevant, and we may need to bring that point back up in a second. Any other comments before I keep going? Okay. So the two relevant links that I have here, this is the section of the DID-Doc conventions, Aries RFC, that defined like how to actually do this. And this has the type listed as DID communication, and you'll notice that that it's mandatorily set to DID communication here. This doesn't say DIDCOM v1 anywhere, because at the time there wasn't really a DIDCOM v1, there was just DIDCOM. The sort of the V1 moniker is something that we added later when we began talking about DIDCOM V2, and we needed a sane way to differentiate between them. And so if you see the lack of V1 in all of these documents, that's because there wasn't a V1 at the time. So if it doesn't say, it more or less means it's V1. And this specifies the type as DID communication. And then Colton, let's come back to the structure and the format of this as well. The other relevant link is actually here from within the DIDCOM v2 spec, and I've linked right to the relevant piece here. this has a type of DIDCOM messaging. This is deliberately different from the type used for DIDCOM v1 for a number of reasons. The primary reason, and then there's sub reasons, I guess. The primary reason is that we need to be able to specify different things for, and there's different expectations around DIDCOM v1 and DIDCOM v2, and having a different type allows both types to exist within a DID document, but also signals more or less support for DIDCOM v1 and DIDCOM v2 as an independent thing. There's also, of course, some structure change information in here, and looking at the type will help you know what type of structure you can actually expect here. And so that's the important aspect there. Type, you'll notice, is required to be DIDCOM messaging, as specified here. So there's two things here, and I've noticed in the implementation there's differing things. This one didn't change, although it was formalized at a particular point, and it was not super well documented. We just kind of like thrown some stuff as some code before this. But this particular RFC has not changed in years. And anyone doing DIDCOM v1 communication, in my understanding, should still be using the type as DID communication with this block. As software implements DIDCOM v2, the ideal way to do it is with an additional service block. If you can accept both DIDCOM v1 and DIDCOM v2, you have two service blocks. It's entirely possible for the URI specified to be the same in both if your code is ready to differentiate between messages by inspecting the actual inbound message. But but you also have the opportunity to list a separate endpoint if you would like, as it ends up there, and if that's useful to you. So these are the two types of things as we're adding. The advantage now is that one of the things you can do is simply by updating the service endpoints or providing a DID doc with a service endpoint to another party, you can signal whether you support DIDCOM v2 or not, as we enter a phase where more and more software is supporting that, and you might want to detect whether you should be expecting to communicate with DIDCOM v1 or DIDCOM v2 with the other party. So before we get to talk about the structure differences, any questions, thoughts, corrections, complaints, general observations?
Not a complaint, but I'm wondering if we can use DIDCOM messaging and service type, even if we only support DIDCOM v1 as a matter of, I don't know, as part of this migration, let's say, to qualify the hits and preparing the code base for DIDCOM v2.
If we do, we run the kind of assumed risk that the other parties we're communicating with won't understand that we support DIDCOM v1 instead of DIDCOM v2.
Technically, I think you could add the DIDCOM messaging there, so long as your accept does not include that you support DIDCOM v2. But as Sam mentioned, some implementations may not parse the accept. But that, I mean, they should, but just something to look out for.
Yeah, maybe
So
maybe it's like if we were using DID exchange with DID peer 4, right? So I mean, we depend on previous implementations that will understand this new format.
Yeah, so technically speaking, the only opinions you need to care about are the opinions of the people that you're hoping to interoperate with. In theory, that's the community at large, anyone that implements the same specs. And so it kind of depends. It also depends on how long you end up in an in-between state where you're actually supporting, both, or that until full adoption has really come online for DIDCOM v2 and DIDCOM v1 isn't really a thing anymore. I think ideally, if development schedules were not an issue, then being as clear as possible, I think, is the ideal case. If you are if that presents a problem for the development, and I don't think this is a lot, and I'll talk about what I anticipate this involving in a second, but um, if you see the development of this as a problem, then we can continue in a state that we kind of are right now, which is the fact that things are not really in line with what they should be, but we kind of know that and we work around it anyway. So the world is a little bit lumpy, and this may be one of those things that sort of cause that to occur. Right now we're in a state where there's differences as it exists, and so the question is do we actually spend the time to correct it for DIDCOM v1, or do we just plow ahead with DIDCOM v2? Really, what this requires is that anytime you create a DID and pass it to the other party, that you actually include a service endpoint of each type that you support receiving. And if your code can already differentiate between the two, then the URI could in fact just be identical. And the accept block may vary here a little bit as well. We don't under accept, we link so we talk about the different types of envelopes, the envelopes that actually exist. And I'll notice the DIDCOM v2 is the one specified in this spec. There are two mentioned in here, and one of them is an envelope that sort of laid the foundation for DIDCOM v2 support by anticipating an envelope change. That this is not necessary to use unless, of course, you have other parties using it. If you're doing DIDCOM v1 and with the old envelope style and you're targeting DIDCOM v2, then that's probably what you want to jump to immediately at this point in the timeline. And so that is that's there. So these are the defined profiles of what you're actually passing, and you'll want to make sure that those match. Those can also be used to anticipate the received envelope style. It's worth noting that the DIDCOM v2 should be the one used with by default with the DIDCOM messaging service endpoint type. And if you do it, also extend to some of these other code bases that are not exactly what is specified here, but close. You also may include it there as well. But the expectation is that the message presented inside is in fact formatted like a DIDCOM v2 message. You wouldn't, for example, and this is not made super clear here, but you wouldn't, for example, use DIDCOM messaging, but also specify that you can receive a message of AIP1, because that's not a DIDCOM v2 message at all. You could, but it's unlikely. That's a little bit of a logical mismatch. So you won't break things by saying that you do that if in fact you do receive those. But it's a little bit weird there. And this may be what you're asking, Ariel, is if you can actually specify that you use the old envelope type even though you're receiving DIDCOM v2 messages. You could, but it kind of depends on what happens in this transfer time between DIDCOM v1 and DIDCOM v2, and what other software that you're working with is looking at these values and expecting certain behavior based on it. That was a little wordy of an answer. I apologize.
So if I could attempt a summary, Sam, and then you can tell me if I'm correct or not here. Technically, yes, we can specify that we accept DIDCOM v1 using DIDCOM messaging service type, but it's unlikely that we'll be able to have the right level of backwards compatibility because most DIDCOM v1 implementations are expecting the DID communication service type. Is that right?
Yes, I think that was said more clearly than I did. But the last statement you said is most DIDCOM v1 implementations are expecting the DID communication service type may or may not be true, right? So I don't know, and we have people here that I'm sure are far more knowledgeable about what's implemented where. But for example, one of the particular issues here is in Credo, and they're using DIDCOM messaging now, even though they're intending, I believe, for it to be used with DIDCOM v1. Is that correct?
Not exactly. Actually, if you look at the further on the thread, you will see that actually the problem is on the parsing of a DIDCOM of a DID peer 2. Actually, Credo is not using DIDCOM messaging for when you create DID peer. So we are still using the DID communication as it is. Actually, because of that, thanks to that, it's compatible with Akapai, right? Daniel, you could test it and it worked. But the issue is when we are parsing a DID peer 2 that has a DM encoded, it will try to well to unpack it to a wrong format. It's only that, but actually, as you say, the services that or the agents that are encoding DID peers 2 with that DM are not actually compatible with DIDCOM v1. And at the moment in Credo, we only support DIDCOM v1, so it wouldn't work anyway. So yeah, that's mainly the issue.
Okay, so this is an unpacking of DIDCOM v2 ambiguity in
Yeah.
whether DM comes out to DIDCOM messaging or not. Man, DIDCOM, yeah. So this is DIDCOM messaging is the string to be replaced here. We don't have one for DID communication.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you
That's
could in fact just do this instead of specify DM, you just specify the long string of DID communication and it would work.
Yeah.
That way. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's like the gift that keeps on giving. I apologize for creating that again. So that adds some clarity there. So Credo is using DIDCOM messaging, except there's this awkward unpacking of DID peer methods, DID peer method 2, that with some confusion that has led to the wrong type actually being specified by accident, more or less. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah. When we create DID peer, we are using DID communication service type, so it is completely fine. Of course, it will work with Akapai, for instance, but it will not work with other agents that are or newer agents that don't come from Aries community like Veramo. The only issue is when we are when Credo receives a DID peer 2 that includes a DM encoded service type, as it will try to unpack it as a DIDCOM messaging, but it will expect it to have the older format. I mean the DID communication format, but as I said, it will not be compatible with that agent anyway, so it's not a major problem, I will say.
So I think the caution. So if I understand what you're saying, Ariel, the major thing that we need to be careful of is that if you're using DID peer 2 and not using it with DIDCOM v2 endpoints, you need to make sure to construct it using DID communication spelled out instead of the DM short flag.
Yes.
That makes sense. Does anyone have questions about that? Or had that already been worked out in issues?
I think that's been mostly worked out. For instance, that's how Akapai and AFJ are interoperating right now, as Ariel mentioned. I think the issue and what Colton was raising was we actually had an agent that was using the DIDCOM messaging service type and using it quote unquote correctly. We had the the service endpoint was a list of objects rather than being a string. And Credo was expecting the did community. Sorry, I keep on doing that. The didcom messaging service type to look like the did communication service type, even though there's structural differences, and that's why Colton ultimately raised this issue, and then it kind of evolved into discussions about what was supported in did peer 2 and stuff, I think.
Well, the reason why I actually raised the issue was because somebody else on our team raised or mentioned it to me that they had to parse didcom messaging type as did communication because from my understanding of their account, they were saying that Credo was sending didcom messaging, and that's the reason why I initially raised the issue, is because that was my understanding. But they where they were sending didcom messaging, but it was structured like did communication.
Has that also been fixed, or is that still a known issue?
From my understanding, based off of the discussion in that issue, the reason why I was raising it was a non-issue, but the other issues were discovered related to the parsing in this case.
Exactly. For the reception. It's not an issue with Akapai or probably with other, maybe the .NET implementation, but it might be with some other newer implementations. I think the one who raised another issue also in Akapai was the developer of the Swift implementation, I think.
Yeah, I think this point, Stephen, and you're mentioning too. I wouldn't use DM1 and DM2. I would use DM and then DC is probably what we should use. But I think the only thing we're sacrificing is a handful of bytes without having to touch anything at the moment. And this is
Yeah,
like an
what?
issue that will go away. So I don't think that including a new short flag is a good idea.
Yeah,
To make
I'm
that
like,
happen here.
besides, we're moving on to didcom 2 v2, so we should be moving away from this issue entirely, anyways.
Yeah. So this is only a problem for a shortish period of time.
Am I understanding that the issue is more about a object versus a string and interpreting it, and basically an implementation needs to try one and then the other to get it right? So it's not so much that string. The string is important, but it's also the object versus
Yeah. So
non. Is that the
let's
issue?
let's talk about this. So in the service block of didcom v1, we had the service endpoint listed here as just a string. And I believe it also specified it may be. Nope, it's just a URL-based endpoint. So it's just one that you're actually specifying there. And then all the other information like routing keys, etc. We in the accept block, we specified outside here just underneath service. There's a big debate about this because there were a handful of implementations of the did core spec that only allowed ID, type, and service endpoint to exist at this level, and would actually like puke and not be able to parse a did document if in fact it encountered anything else. One of the methods that you can, and this gets into some did core debate stuff that's like really, really old. There was this form where the service endpoint could either just be a string, which would be the URI, but it could also just be, I think it could also just be an object or a string of objects in the same way to actually make that happen here. So here's the two different forms. You'll notice that this just has one service endpoint. This has more than one service endpoint. So this moved into here with the URI of this. And this is what it is. If you have DIDCOM messaging, this block form of service endpoint or the list of blocks form, so form of this should be what you expect every time. And so that's the case. One easy way to parse these is you detect if it's an object, and then just stick the object into a list and then parse it this way. And that would be a way to solve that. I don't really want to replay the debate about whether we should adapt our spec to accommodate poorly implemented DIDCOM parsing or DIDDoc parsing libraries. That's a separate issue. But that's the way that it has been organized to avoid those particular problems. A separate debate entirely is whether your JSON parsing should be fragile enough that if it encounters extra attributes, it vomits. Also a separate discussion. So that's what the difference is. So I feel pretty strongly that if you're sending something of type did communication, this is the structure you should be going for. If you're sending something of DIDCOM messaging, you're gonna end up with either an object format for service endpoint or a list of objects format for service endpoint, and that's it. I think that sending DIDCOM messaging with this block format or sending did communication with this block format is likely to be insanely confusing and is not something we should seek to spread support for.
And it does make the parsing of those a bit more complicated in terms of statically typed languages. So like for Python and JavaScript, things are fine, but say for example, Rust or Go or whatever, it does make things more complicated.
A little. But you can also work with the default method of parsing may be angry at the fact that you may get a list or an object back. In all of those languages, it's possible to inspect what you're actually getting and then do the right thing. And so you may not be familiar with the advanced options of JSON parsing, but I've never encountered a language that did not have the option to correctly parse something of one of these forms to do it. Again, it may not be automatic or the default behavior of those libraries, but advanced options will exist there. And yeah, Daniel, your comment in chat that also has 3 thumbs up at the moment. I think that not adding another shortened term is a good plan. We want didpeer2 to also die, and so using it as long as we need to, but not really seeking to enhance it, specifically when the only cost is a slight expansion of bytes, I think is a good idea.
That said, should we put a clarification in that said if you want, put the full phrase in, put the full text in and don't use DM or not?
That would not comprise a change, which could be good, but could also just contain a warning that says, listen, just do not do this, right? Do not use the DM unless you expect that to be the case. I'm not opposed to that at all. Again, that's not a change. That would be a clarification and a warning.
That I would only do with Daniel's blessing because he knows this way better.
Daniel, are you opposed to here be dragons?
I think clarification should be fine. I think the text of the didpeer2 spec as it stands, if you're following it closely, would lead you to that conclusion anyways. But I don't think it would be problematic to just add a quick clarification in there.
So we have the lookup table for the common string abbreviations. And it may be here that we stick a little warning and then say, listen, if you really mean did dash communication instead of did come messaging, do not use DM. Obviously, I agree that it's specified there, but apparently this is a pit that at least one person has fallen into. Cool. Any volunteers to create that PR?
Well, I think it wasn't a pit necessarily that someone fell into. I think it was more of a copy paste issue.
Still an issue.
Yep.
Any volunteers to make that clear, that warning PR? It's not even a clarification, it's just a warning, really.
I'll do it. Sure.
Awesome. And Daniel, can we lean on you for the review of Steven's
Yep, I can do that.
warning? Awesome. Okay, this has been a nice wandery discussion around an important topic. Have we not touched on something that we need to as part of this discussion? Okay, I think we can consider this done. Thanks for bringing this up, and hopefully that ends up fully resolved. If it doesn't, or we've missed something, then someone please wave a flag so that we can make sure that we clear that up. Daniel, next up on the agenda is the mediation scenario creating unqualified DIDs. Do you want to give us a brief discussion of the issue?
Yeah, I'll see if I can summarize it quickly. So the title of the issue and the actual discussion that need to take place is kind of two different things. That's a little confusing. Sorry about that. But ultimately, we've struggled within ACPI for a while with this issue within our mediation support, where ACPI is a mediation client, where there's an opportunity for a race condition to take place. When you're forming a connection, you create keys for your DIDs, and then you need to send those keys in a keylist update message to the mediator to let the mediator know that those keys should be routed to you as a recipient. And then in the process, after you've sent off that keylist update message, you should technically wait for the keylist update response to be received before you send off your DID exchange request or response or whatever it is to the other party. The challenge right now that we're experiencing within ACPI specifically, and I'll touch on why it's an ACPI specific thing right now and not impacted in other code bases. But the problem we're experiencing right now is that we're not waiting for the keylist update response. And so we just send off the keylist update and then immediately send off a DID exchange request. And that creates an opportunity for the recipient to receive the message and respond to it before the mediator has fully committed the keylist update for that recipient. And so the message would be dropped on the return to the original requester. Okay, so the first question that comes up after that is, why doesn't ACPI explicitly wait for the keylist update response? And the answer is because generally speaking, we expect messages to be asynchronous. We send the message off, and then we drop the connection, and then we expect to receive a response at some point in the future, right? And then picking up an exchange in process at that asynchronous point in the future is tricky. So we just, send off the message and hope that it'll be done by the time we're sending off a DID exchange request, which hasn't been the case. So we've tried a couple of workarounds to work through this. So we essentially pushed it up to the controller for it to be the controller's problem. It shouldn't be the controller's problem. I think we need to eliminate that expectation. But the alternative is for us to add a lot of complexity to the handling of our connection establishment processes, just because that keylist update and response cycle is happening asynchronously. So what I proposed here as a potential solution to help with that problem is adding a requirement to the coordinate mediation protocol that the mediator is required to support return routing for keylist updates, so that we can have at least some stronger guarantees that the message will be coming back in a reasonable amount of time, and Akapai can sit and wait for the response to be received and then resume the process of constructing the did exchange request immediately, instead of having to let go of the exchange and then pick it up at some future time. Does that make sense? Can I clarify that any further? So the reason that isn't a problem in other implementations is because, to my knowledge at least, most implementations like mobile wallets, for instance, that are expecting or required essentially to interact with a mediator in order to receive messages, there's already a strong requirement that it expects to receive a response from the mediator basically within a reasonable timeout. And so it's already placing that expectation that it'll be receiving a response somewhat synchronously in that process. So
I think I understand. And does anyone have any questions about what the problem is? So I have a note here that says, I wish this wasn't so, but I recognize that it is. And what I mean by that is that it would be great if in our code that handles inbound messages, you had a way to register and say, listen, I'm expecting a message of like this thread ID from or from this sender or of this message type, and when it happens, please send it to me. Maybe you also send it to existing message processing, but I would just give me a copy of it, and then it's more or less a method, relatively easy within the code to say send this message and then await this response. And then practically it becomes about the same as sending an HTTP post and then getting a response back from it with roughly the same error states and conditions, but would be something that is nicer to do. I recognize, though, that that's a deeper thing that we need to address within message processing pipelines, and this may not be the moment to do that. And so I recognize that setting the expectation of response is probably the simplest clarification that would make this work. That's the summary of my comment there.
I think I agree with the notion that it should be possible for us to await a specific response. Where we experience complications, especially within Akapai, is because Akapai is intended to be in a cluster. We want it to be horizontally scalable. We then need to worry about making sure that the correct instance of Akapai is receiving that response, so that we can trigger that asynchronous awaiting and all this stuff. And it kind of takes the complexity up a whole nother level.
Super excellent point. Whereas making a call with return route then just simplifies the entire thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Steven, your hand's up.
So I can think of 5 ways to do this, and I think Daniel's covered them mostly, where the complexity ramps up. So biggest question is, what is the state of return route, and is it a viable way to handle any mediator, I mean, is return route implemented everywhere?
I think return routing is effectively required for any mediator that is servicing mobile wallets.
Okay. So you're confident enough that we're not adding potential complexity because return route isn't always submitted. The only experience I've had with return routing, I was mediating a discussion between a person and Andrew Whitehead while I was in Finland at my data conference, and return routing was like, oh, this is tricky, and so that's my only experience with it. Obviously not hands-on in the code. I don't know how well implemented or how well supported it is.
Yeah. So that's actually one point that I didn't touch on that I did actually mention in my comment, which is this is a requirement that I would propose only imposing on exit nodes, or in other words, basically the mediators that are already intending to support mobile wallets, basically.
But
So
you don't really know that though, right? That's yeah, that's where I'm worried. How do you know that
So the requirements on mediators depends a little bit on what kind of mediator or where in a chain of mediators you intend to be. And if you're intending to support a mobile wallet, then that mediator is also going to implement things like the pickup protocol, which includes, the additional requirements of like having a queuing mechanism available for those mediation clients and stuff. So if you don't intend to support mobile wallets, you know what kind of mediator you are, and the kind of mediator you are is only passing received forward messages onto a destination. You're not going to be receiving frequent keyless updates, because that's only something that really happens at the end, at the exit, because you're just passing it on to the next hop in the chain, basically. So in other words, if your mediator is already in a position where it's expecting to service these mobile wallets or clients that don't have their own endpoints available to them, we've already imposed this requirement on them that there's going to be return routing capable and other things too. But yeah.
So dumb question, but
no, go for it, Stu.
dumb question, but sleep doesn't work here, does it?
Sleep is super hacky, man. Like
Oh,
so
I
hacky.
know. I know.
Okay.
So you're looking for a more generalized solution. Is there any concept of queue this message and don't give it back to me? Don't give it back to anyone for, a second, which is similar to sleep, but puts it in a queue.
It's still
I don't know.
sleeping. You're
Yeah,
still
it
assuming
sounds
that
too
you're going to have a
painful.
timeout, which produces both unperformant and unreliable software. So I vote no on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I figured that the co-protocol idea that the parent did, where you get back the message and therefore you activate the parent, all of those require, I get all the complexity of all of those. So I mean, I'm fine with the return route, but I'm just concerned about how, and again, I don't have enough. I just wonder about the, as long as it's expected to be commonly available, then I like it.
Return route, I agree with Daniel that return route is effectively required for anyone doing mediation serving mobile endpoints, or I should say firewall challenged endpoints, of which mobile are there. You could be inside of a firewall and still need one, and you have to go collect messages. So I don't think this is an additional requirement, and really that's the entire reason why return route was created in the first place, is to actually serve. Is to manage mobile agents. It has been in DIDCOM v2. It has been moved to an extension of the spec. It works the same way, but it's been moved to an extension of the specification in recognition that the only parties that actually need it are in fact mediators. And so you cannot support return route in any way if you're not a mediator and still be fully compliant with the spec. And now I'll shut up and let James talk.
Yeah, one of the questions I had is, do we run into an issue if, for instance, we develop our mobile agents to expect a response, which does make the implementation easier before we continue on with the DID exchange, and at the same time the mediator is experiencing high volume, high load, and the performance time gets to a point where it can't respond immediately. There's an issue in that regard, meaning now that process has failed, where if we continue asynchronously how it's designed today, that would be fine. It would just take a couple of more seconds than it would normally. Is that an actual valid concern?
I think it is a concern. Yeah.
So there's a pattern that we've imagined that I don't believe anyone's done, but is actually currently allowed to develop a robust implementation that is a little bit less sensitive to real-time performance issues. There's no reason you can't pre-create a DID and arrange its key with the mediator in advance, and then sit on it before you actually hand that out to anyone as the result of a new connection. So it would be possible, and there's no protocol changes needed to do this. It's already something supported. You could basically kind of keep a list of 5 or 10 pre-arranged DIDs with the mediator that you just leave in a pool of, I haven't used these yet. You pull one out of the pool and you hand it to someone, and it's already been configured previously. And so that's a pattern that we have discussed in the past, but I don't believe anyone has actually implemented. Mostly we've just been relying on the real-time ability of a mediator to respond with an updated key list. So that's not exactly an answer, but I wanted to bring up that the best way to solve, if you have real-time response issues with your mediator, which ideally you would not have, then one of the ways to get around that is to handle it in advance.
So I think that's a solution that's good for like improving the resiliency overall. I guess I would still like to see the coordinate mediation protocol updated with this as a requirement, because it's something that mobile implementations are already kind of dependent on, if that makes sense. And it's just like by convention that it's happening right now, as opposed to by being explicitly outlined within the protocol itself.
I don't disagree. This is not a dot update, and I don't believe we can impose this without doing a version update, which means that this causes a version rev of the protocol with this expectation. It should be a very light change to implement, because this is like the only change. But I do think it's practical. One of the thoughts that I had about defining requiring this on exit nodes is that instead of placing that requirement, we basically say that if you serve mobile, firewall challenged agents, including mobile, i.e., you implement the message pickup protocol, then you must support return route for these calls. And that way we avoid the definition of what an exit node is, et cetera, and just say if you support this protocol, then you also have to have this behavior as part of this one.
Yeah, that makes sense, I think. I would, conceptually the exit node is where that is taking place in my brain, but I recognize that like defining exactly whether your mediator is an exit node or not might be a little fuzzy. So shifting the definition a little bit towards whether your mediator is intended to service a particular client type. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Right.
Could you make it the return route be optional, meaning the mediator should provide support for that, but the mobile agent doesn't have to do the return route? Because that could have the scenario I outlined could be mitigated by a specific code base if they decided to implement the more complex strategy.
Yes. So the requirement would be placed on the mediators, not on the client, which means that what Daniel's proposing would satisfy your request that it be optional for the client, for the mobile.
Cool. Yeah.
So are we proposing that this be something that can be discovered via the discovered features protocol?
Yes, but only because there's a new version of the pickup protocol. Or sorry, coordinate mediation. We'd rev the version number on coordinate mediation because this is a new requirement that isn't optional, which allows us to do a dot release. And so because it's a new version, you would be able to discover features that were capable of that.
So my question there then is there's some discussion about supporting one use case versus another use case, mobile versus Akapai. That's not necessarily this the protocol that we're talking about here. It's a set of protocols that one use case or the other use case needs.
No, it's not a different in use case. It's just that one use case cares about it and none of the other ones do. Does that make sense?
But I should be able to discover that via the protocol discovery, basically.
Yes, you would know that because you support coordinate mediation 3 or whatever the next number is, that it is expected to honor a return route on a keylist update call.
Let me take a step back there, Sam. What I'm saying is Daniel's talking about two different mediators being designed for different use cases.
Yes.
And my question there is in the mobile case and the Akapai case, we'll be able to differentiate that via the protocol discovery, right? There's nothing like special in the mediator design that would not be discoverable is what I'm asking.
I still don't really understand the question you're asking.
So Daniel's indicating that you might have a mediator that's only designed to work with Akapai's use case, and you might have a mediator that's only designed for the mobile use case. And my question is there's a set of protocols that the mobile use case might need, and that's right now we're fully making that available to be discovered when
Yeah,
a mobile
message pickup. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not really the Akapai use case. It's a non-firewall challenge use case as opposed to a firewall challenge use case is the differentiator. But your point is that don't we already have differences in protocols? The answer is we do. Pickup the message pickup is the differentiating protocol, but the behavior that we need is not actually in message pickup. It's in coordinate mediation. So what we need to do is evaluate the potential new protocol that places this requirement, and then see whether it satisfies all the needs that we actually have. And at the point you're getting to is we need to make sure that anyone who wants to support that protocol is able to confirm that behavior to make it happen.
Yeah, and then my last point here is that perhaps Akapai should be using the pickup protocol in the sense that there isn't a guarantee that you'll always be connected to the mediator.
No, but there's other existing messages to handle that. The expectation is that would be handled via retry delivery via pickup, and I think that requiring non-firewall challenged parties to then pick up their messages is not a pattern that I think we want to impose on agents that are generally connected and you just may need to retry. It doesn't mean that the mediator doesn't temporarily hold on to the message. It just means they're expected to redeliver as opposed to have them picked up, which is the fundamental difference between a firewall challenged and a not firewall challenged agent. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And depending on retry intervals and things like that, you might get yourself in trouble there.
Yeah, I'm not going to solve someone else's network level consideration with a protocol change. If you have a device that is capable of doing that, they need to get reconnected and so that messages can be delivered again. I think that trying to route around that particular problem with a protocol change is the wrong layer to solve that particular problem. So backing out just a little, Daniel, I like this, but I think we need to carefully look at how we impose the requirement and how that is discovered in order for the keyless stuff to work. Because I'm not sure we have all the corner cases covered in how I imagine in my head at least. So we'll need to kind of look at the actual proposed new version to see if it solves the problem with the way that we think it is without creating any other ambiguities. But yeah, a fan of doing it this way. Okay, we're over time. Thanks, folks, for coming. It's been a good discussion. And Subhas has dropped already, but we'll get to his question next week. Well, not next week because it's IW, but the week after that. Thanks, folks, and I hope your week is a great one.
Thank you.